And joining us now, Ramesh Thakur. He is director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and we welcome you back to TVO.
Glad to be back.
I want to read something that Michael Williams wrote in The Guardian a couple of months ago and then get your view on this after I finish reading it. Finally, he writes, the U.S. should take a cue from its northern neighbors, that's us, and enunciate a strategy that is sustainable and achievable. This started last week, but it needs to be repeated and reinforced time and time again. The focus should be on training Afghan forces, on strengthening local government in Afghanistan, improving Afghan relations, regional political reconciliation, and finally improving humanitarian standards. The onus, as the Canadians decided, should be on creating a situation in which the status quo can be maintained. So how do you like his prescription for Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not sure that anyone would disagree with that. The trick is, how do you get it actually done? How do you implement it? And I think, to their credit, the Americans under the Obama administration have recently in some ways gone towards that, particularly with the new commander that they have appointed, General Stanley McChrystal, who has said that the effectiveness of our policy will be judged not by the number of enemy soldiers we kill, but by the number of Afghan civilians we protect. And I think that brings it much closer in line to the way we Canadians tend to approach it.
You recently went there. You came back, you wrote an op-ed piece for the Globe and Mail in which you said you didn't think very much had been accomplished. What do you think's gone wrong?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think initially, by now, there would be general agreement around the world, in fact, including in Afghanistan, including in Washington, that they got distracted by this war of choice in Iraq. On that, I think the Obama critique during the presidential campaign and since he came into office is right. And I think he's also right in saying you can't blame just President Bush for that, because the rest of the country, after all, went along, including Congress. Now I think they are recognizing that Afghanistan is important in its own right, and in some ways Afghanistan and Pakistan together are far more complicated and potentially far more dangerous for everyone, because you've got all the worst fears combined in a terrible nightmare.
Far more dangerous than Iraq ever might have been or could have been, is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. We have terrorism confirmed with Pakistan as a source of terrorism, and not necessarily implying that the government is involved in that, but a lot of terrorists have come from that. We've got nuclear weapons there, we've got dangers of failed states there with a massive population, and implications for the entire region and the entire Islamic world.
But is it your sense now that the world has refocused appropriately on Afghanistan and has its eye on the right ball now?
I think it has its eye on the right ball, and they're trying to figure out how best to go forward. The difficulty, I think, now is that while the Americans finally focus on that, the rest of the alliance is tired of that and wants to leave.
Okay, so you go to Afghanistan and you write in your piece, Afghanistan is not merely under foreign occupation, but feels quasi-colonized. What did you see that gave you that impression?
Well, just the presence of foreign troops, the way in which embassies, for example, construct new buildings and just divide streets, partition whole streets, so that the Afghan local people, and this is in the capital city, they can't even use their own streets. The real shots are called by the foreigners. People describe President Karzai dismissively as the mayor of Kabul. I'm not sure that even that is accurate. A mayor of Toronto actually has more authority in this city than Karzai has in Kabul. It's real power, as I said in the op-ed, I think is divided in the end between the Afghan warlords and the American overlords.
And I understand that you think that so little has been accomplished because the Iraq was a diversion and took our eye off that. But all right, Iraq is now, it is what it is now, right? It's sort of under control. The war is over. Yes, they've got a job to do there still. But what's preventing people from making progress in Afghanistan right now?
Well, I think Iraq was a distraction. That was one factor. Then I think there has been a marked aversion in US circles, particularly during the Bush administration, to anything called nation building. Well, again, as in Iraq, military victory is one thing, but the military victory is pointless unless you get a lasting, secure peace in the aftermath. And for that, you have to engage in nation building. The dilemmas are real and they're structural. How do you proceed with the tasks of nation building as an outsider, and yet at the same time transfer authority, transfer competence, build up local capacity? There are no easy answers to that. How do you avoid creating a dependency on the part of Afghans on foreign occupation, foreign forces, and foreign assistance?
That which you are describing, how long does it take?
It takes a long time. I would think we would still be there for another 5 to 10 years in some capacity, including some military force. The Taliban have been gaining strength. I'm not sure that they have increased their numbers, but certainly they've got better weapons, they've got more weapons, they've got more networks, and they've been exploding the roadside bombs many more times. I think the figures I've seen were around 450 2 years ago, 760 1 year ago, and in the last year, ending May this year, that number is up to 1,200. But because they're using volunteers rather than trained fighters, the effectiveness of the increased bombing has not been as deadly as it could have been.
Why do you think it's taken so long for the West to kind of figure out what the right approach is to having success in Afghanistan?
There's a long statement, an old quote from Winston Churchill: you can always depend on the Americans to get it right after having tried everything else first.
And
I think there is an element of that. There was an aversion to nation building, there was a focus in Iraq, there was a belief that they knew everything, they didn't need allies, they did not need advice. I think the late Robin Cook, the Foreign Secretary, the British Foreign Secretary, he got it right when he said for the neocons, diplomatic allies are not seen as signs of diplomatic strength, but as evidence of military weakness. It was too much of a military security approach, not enough focus on civilian aspects, on protecting the Afghan civilians, on building the capacity, building a sustainable economy, taking care of regional aspects. I think for too long they ignored Pakistan's double game and double dealing in this whole thing. Now increasingly they've been more and more blunt about saying, no, Pakistan has to do its share and stop that from being a base for attacks into Afghanistan. I think there is recognition now that it's a combined or unified battle space between Afghanistan and Pakistan, hence the phrase AFPAC.
In which case, how long does it take to transform what has been mostly a military operation right now into something that is more developmental, training, that kind of thing?
The results will take a long time coming. The efforts should begin urgently. The danger is with the increase of American troops by another 21,000, and with the pullout by, or the threatened pullout by other countries, including Canada, and whenever it is now, our deadline comes pretty soon, that again they might have to be, or they might revert to greater emphasis on military and security means, to the neglect of the accompanying political, developmental, and nation-building efforts.
I'm going to read an excerpt from that op-ed piece that we talked about earlier from May 7th. And here we go. Although most people expect Karzai to win the presidential election in August, few are enthused by the prospect of having him for 5 more years. One puzzle is whether the Taliban will take part in the political process, perhaps in preparation for next year's parliamentary elections. They could stay outside, waiting for the low-lying fruits of political victory to fall into their laps as the coteries around the president become increasingly more corrupt, powerless, and inefficient, and public cynicism and revulsion grows proportionately. We keep hearing this, that the Karzai government, every time you see Karzai on television, he looks like this saintly figure who all of our hopes and aspirations are wrapped up in. But then you hear stories of a breadth and depth of corruption inside his administration that makes you blanch. Give me some examples. What's going on?
Well, there's all sorts of examples. The police are widely mistrusted. They engage in extortion, they take bribery, and not for things that are illegal to do. You know, you might expect, if you're asking for some improper favors, you might have to pay people. People have to pay bribes to get what is theirs by right. They are beaten up on all sorts of issues. The police are ill-trained, ill-disciplined, very badly paid. The army is not all that better either. So I think the quote you began with, the humanitarian standards, that discipline has to be instilled in the police and the military as we build them up. Now,
who has to instill it?
I think it has to be a combination of the Afghan government and foreign well-wishers as well. It can't be either one by itself. I think we have to deliver on security assistance and nation building for some time yet, but in return, I think we have a right to expect that the government will tackle these issues seriously. To date, there hasn't been the evidence. Now, again, to be fair to President Karzai, he has to play the game in ways that keeps him in power. I think we tend to forget that, and certain statements that the Americans made encouraged him to make political alliances in preparation for the presidential election. with characters that are not necessarily the most savory in the country.
Well, he's got, you tell me, does he not have control of three of the most significant institutions in Afghanistan? I mean, there's the independent election process, the police, and the press. Is he in charge of all three?
He's not in charge of all three. I mean, there are characters around, there are powerful cabinet figures with whom he has to cut a deal in order to survive. There are warlords that he has had to accommodate to various degrees. And certainly while I was there, people said, well, some of the members of parliament and some of the members in government are themselves warlords with not necessarily the best records in the past. So he's got to cut those deals. He has to operate within his environment. I think we tend to forget that. So we don't want absolute standards that match ours in Canada. But even relative to the local situation, I think he could do a lot better than he has done. And for that, he may need support and understanding of his constraints as well as imperatives.
Do you think the Taliban can be engaged with politically?
I don't know, to be honest. It sounds like an oxymoron to say there are moderate Taliban. I think what people mean is that not everyone who has fired a shot in anger has done so because he's a committed ideologue as a Taliban. Maybe someone's uncle or father or mother or sister were killed or molested by some occupation forces, and this is a revenge thing rather than belief in Taliban. If you talk to people in general, I think they have as much revulsion for the Taliban as we seem to have in the West. They don't like the things that the Taliban do, and we saw that recently in Pakistan as well. When public knowledge becomes very well known about the lashes and the acid throwing on the girls who go to school and stuff like that, they react adversely and very strongly to that as well. But the difficulty for them is, do they believe that we will stay there forever, we meaning the outsiders? Or do they say, well, they'll be here for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, then who comes back?
Right.
The Taliban. So we better not make enemies of them. That's the difficulty. I think if they could be convinced that we are there for the long haul and convinced of the government's efforts to eradicate corruption, promote good governance, institutionalize good governance, then I think the people might be prepared to take on the Taliban more forcibly and more forcefully themselves. So I think we should not mistake the rise of the Taliban with growing support for them. I don't think there is.
Having said that, how much damage do you think President Karzai did to his own international standing when he supported that law that allowed men essentially to force themselves on their wives sexually after, you know what I'm saying?
I do indeed. I think he did enormous damage to himself both internationally and domestically. I spoke while I was there to some of the women MPs. They were shocked. I got a better understanding of how they all think, including the women MPs who are strongly opposed to that law, as well as President Karzai. He did explain somewhat lamely that he hadn't actually read the whole thing through.
Right.
Apparently that may be true, that they were manipulated or maneuvered into signing that without realizing just what they were doing, and they thought that it could be stopped at a later date. Once it became clear that they essentially had been tricked into it, I think the backlash came. I'm not sure how much support you'd get from the people as opposed to the Islamist mullahs who speak in the name of religion, not in the name of the people.
Let me read another excerpt from your op-ed piece for the Globe and Mail. The strengthened U.S. military presence and activity may be necessary, for no other country seems willing to take up the security slack. But it does come with a heightened risk of civilian casualties and culturally offensive behavior. Just as there is a need to shift from heavy military to a major civilian footprint, so at some stage the lead international actor should be the United Nations. For all its faults, the organization has no peer in nation building. Do you think the U.S. would be prepared to allow the United Nations to take that lead role?
That's a good question. I think you need a partnership. If they're going to get out of it, at some stage the United Nations has to take over the lead role. So it's not a question of whether the U.S. will be prepared. I think with the right circumstances and with the right backing, my expectation would be that the United States would actually welcome that. Come the time when the security situation has been stabilized and the task shifts primarily to nation building with backup military security if necessary and when warranted, then I think, yes, they would be willing to do that, provided you get good people in there. And that remains a difficulty, not the least because of the political maneuverings between the various major donors and the major powers who run the UN system. the UN finds it very difficult to get in place the best people for the job, regardless of other considerations.
Well, let me get your view on two of the Americans who are right near the top in leading this effort. You know, the Obama administration put Richard Holbrooke sort of in charge of that region of the world, and then Peter Galbraith was just appointed his deputy. Do you have confidence in what those two are able to achieve?
I think Peter Galbraith is deputy to the UN Special Rep of the Secretary General. Yes, I don't know Richard Holbrooke. I've met Peter Galbraith. I think by reputation and by track record, Holbrooke is a tough but fair negotiator. He learns, he listens, he's been on some listening tours already to the region, to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also through India, even though that's not part of his mandate. Peter Galbraith, I think, is very experienced. He's got a background in the Balkans as well. And I actually met him in East Timor when he was there we were there on a shared visit in different circumstances. I think that they would both be good. There is a willingness to consult. There is a willingness to consider major regional actors who need to be brought on board, because ultimately they are the ones who are going to make or break whatever happens in Afghanistan. So I think all those signs are good. Is there anyone better in the US who could have done this? Not that I'm aware of. So I was actually quite pleased to learn of those appointments.
And does the United Nations have a rebuilt presence there, a rebuilt reputation among the population?
No, it doesn't. I think it needs to, but it doesn't. The United Nations chose a light footprint approach to that, partly because they were getting fed up with all the criticisms and the difficulties and the problems they had in Iraq, being subordinated to the Americans and then being seen as part of the American campaign and part of the American presence. They wanted to avoid that. But the result is that very few of the good people, the best people within the UN, are really prepared to undertake jobs and tasks and assignments in a high-risk country with a high threat environment where they're playing second fiddle to the Americans. And so even the vacancies there, I think there's a 1/3 vacancy rate for the UN posts. And if you consider that some people are on leave, on stress leave because it's a hardship post at any given time, effectively at any given time, approximately only half the UN posts are actually occupied on the ground. That's not acceptable.
You said much of the world refers to this part of the world now as AFPAC. So we've talked about the AF part. Let's spend our remaining moments talking about the PAC part. Do you think the United States was prepared for the deteriorating situation in Pakistan?
No, they were not prepared for that. And I think they focused on Afghanistan in isolation. And the Afghan government, again, you know, President Karzai has been vindicated on this from the start. He and his government said, look, we have to deal with the problem of Pakistan. They said it publicly a number of times and were rebuked rather than the issue being taken up. The Indians said it repeatedly that the source of terrorism in the region is Pakistan, with government knowledge and perhaps with government, or not government, but certainly rogue elements of the intelligence services with their complicity. That was ignored as yet another familiar thing from arch rivals India and Pakistan. But in fact, that has been true, and I don't think you can divide Pakistan's eastern border from its western border and say we'll focus on eradicating terrorism on the northwest frontiers, but ignore what's happening in the east. I think it's one combined set of actors with support, encouragement, and a lot of sympathy from the intelligence services and to some extent from the military as well. Part of the dilemma is if you're a Pakistan military officer, you want to take on the Taliban seriously, but you don't know whether your superior or your inferior, subordinate, might in fact be a sympathetic Taliban mole. If so, you take strong action, the next day you're dead. So there are those real risks. And I think it's taken some time progressively, several years, before the Americans, analysts and government people, woke up to the very strong need to bring Pakistan actively into this common fight against terror. I think they began to succeed when the Pakistan Taliban turned against the Pakistan government itself. They in turn thought they could control the Taliban, direct them as necessary in Afghanistan as a strategic asset, use them as necessary against India, their old enemy. Now, increasingly, they are themselves the victims. In fact, in many ways, I think they have become the primary victims of Islamist and extremist terrorist threats from within Pakistan.
Do you think Pakistan is close to a failed state now?
I think so, yes.
What does that mean?
It means the world could be a lot more dangerous than it is at the moment. It's traditionally, you know, they say about Pakistan that it's been ruled by the 3 A's: the army, America, and Allah. The government has never been a major power center in its own right. Civilian governments have alternated with military, but have been permitted to survive on sufferance by the military. The military has had an intelligence wing that has cultivated extremist elements to the point where now to attack the Taliban is to attack Islam, and that is to question the identity of Pakistan. So they have allowed the situation to deteriorate to this point. In the meantime, they have ignored tasks of development and nation building. And the contrast with India is very striking to me. I mean, we just had elections there with 420 million people voting out of 718 million who could. The counting began at 8 in the morning as scheduled on the day that was scheduled. The results started coming in early in the day. The results were known by the end of the day. The results were a surprise, which is a good testament to genuine democracy. And no one questioned the accuracy of the results. And no one questioned the verdict. And they said, okay, this is the people's verdict. Let it be. And they congratulated the victors. And the defeated said, we must study inwards ourselves what we did wrong. That's a striking phenomenon in that part of the world. When you think of the circle of fragile and failing states around India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan, and God forbid, Pakistan. So I think India should be brought in as a partner, engaged, and could serve as a model. Now, how you convince Pakistanis that India is a possible model, not the enemy, not a threat, that's I cannot answer.
Sell.
That's a tough sell.
Is it past the point where you could win the hearts and minds, where the Americans could win the hearts and minds of the Pakistani people?
I don't think so. The United States is still enormously popular as a dream come true for many people. And part of the expressions of anti-Americanism reflect the frustrations that the American foreign policy does not seem to reflect their own values in terms of supporting efforts at democracy, rule of law, human rights within these countries. For me, the classic placard in India was, "Yankee, go home and take me with you." that expresses that ambivalence very nicely. I think Pakistanis feel like that as well. So I think there is a reservoir of support for institutions of democracy and good governance. And if you build that with Americans and you build that with the support of Indians, bearing in mind the sensitivity that India's involvement in Pakistan can be politically risky. But nonetheless, I think there is a reservoir of goodwill even within India.
Well, let me give you one example
Sure.
of what the average Pakistani might see. He or she might see unmanned American drone planes flying into his territory and obviously attempting to take out Taliban positions. And he or she might conclude that this is a rather cowardly way of fighting. And therefore, we have no respect for the Americans who send their technology in but don't have the guts to put pilots in their own planes to come in. And every Pakistani, so they say, who is killed by such a drone is another soldier for the other side, is created. Should the U.S. revisit this policy?
Absolutely. I think that has been a very disastrous policy. I think their success or kill ratio in terms of Taliban versus civilians is surprisingly low. So it's not a very effective policy. Courage and valor are deeply valued and revered in that part of the world, more so than in other parts. In that sense, they are an old-fashioned feudal tribal society. It's not something that might be viewed on those terms and in that language. It is viewed in those terms, using that language, using that precise language. The fact that it had such a low success ratio means that many more civilians are killed, and for each civilian killed, you get another 4 or 5 or 10 potential recruits to the Taliban cause against this. I think, again, going back to this General McChrystal interview, a couple of things he identified that they are going to do is stricter, tighter rules of engagement and more strictly enforced. So you don't use aerial strikes in high-density areas because you're going to have civilian collateral damage. You confirm kills by taking satellite photos afterwards. If there's been a long time in getting your plane or drone there from when you receive the information or intelligence about a Taliban person there, you reconfirm it again then. These are simple measures, sensible measures, but absolutely urgent. I think that the whole resort to drones clearly, by everyone's consideration, has been a failure and has magnified rather than eased the threat.
In our last 30 seconds here, if you and I sit down in these two chairs 10 years from now, are we going to be talking about a better place or a worse place?
A better place, I hope and expect.
You hope and expect?
Yes.
Despite all of what we've talked about over the last half hour?
I think so, because these are not just my conclusions. These are conclusions that the main allied forces, Western embassies and soldiers and police officers and analysts in Kabul, they all talk about it in these terms as well. So I think there is a recognition of where we went wrong, a determination to get it right, and a determination in many countries to stay the course. The difficulties will come with the publics back home. I think governments should and could do a better job of being honest and explaining the difficulties and explaining the objectives. We need a sensible and serious debate that we really haven't had even in Canada. And I think that's true of most of the Western world.
Very good. Ramesh Thakur, it's very good of you to join us here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.